Welcome. I'm Russ Rapp, and this is my YouTube channel about non-duality. In this video, we're going to discuss how non-duality includes duality. I think that's where some people kind of get off base with the whole concept of non-duality and see this kind of division between what we see with our five senses in the 3D world and what non-duality is pointing to as far as the empty fullness, the nothingness behind everything that we see. And if you have not subscribed to my channel, these live talks are a great way for you to ask questions or comment. It's kind of a free-for-all most of the time. I try to have a topic to kind of focus at least part of the conversation. So subscribe. I'm almost to 400 subscribers at this point. So that'll be the next kind of hurdle to get over. I'm hoping to get to 1,000 eventually, so then I can maybe take these live talks on the road. I've never done it just with the phone. I don't know how the chat would really work. But I like to be, especially when it's nice, I like to be outside to be able to have these discussions. So as you listen here, if you have any questions or comments, type them in the chat. I will be reading those throughout. So, again, welcome. And I guess we can get into the topic of the moment, which is non-duality includes duality. And I guess I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to talk about in this video, but yesterday, the day that never happened, because time is always now. I say that a little tongue-in-cheek, but I was kind of doing some scanning and I came across one person's video about non-duality, someone I hadn't seen before, so I don't know if he talks about it much, but his YouTube handle was something with spiral, and he kind of talked about levels of development as far as relating to spiral dynamics, which I know Ken Wilber, I mentioned him quite a bit, talks about in his books as far as states and levels and how that all works with development. And I think it's a really interesting topic. I did come across another gentleman that had kind of a similar framework as far as the hierarchy of levels of consciousness and that sort of thing. It was Dr. David something, but I don't know. I haven't looked into it. So that's for another day, a future that will never come. Or maybe it will, who knows. Who is probably the most or the wisest person in the world? Hey, Daryl Sanders. I should call you Colonel. Colonel Sanders? No? Okay. Good morning. So, in the video that this person put about on YouTube, it was on the topic of non-duality and how he wasn't interested in the topic of non-duality or talking about it because it's kind of a dead end. And so he kind of talked about the levels of development and kind of the perspective that non-duality doesn't have much of a meaning for kind of lower levels of consciousness. But as you maybe get to the pinnacle, maybe it has relevance because then now you are connected. You not only conceptualize, intellectually understand the idea of non-duality, but you live it. You have this sense of infinite love, the pinnacle of the top of what everyone's trying to achieve with enlightenment and that sort of thing. And so most of the time when people talk about non-duality, it's really isn't saying anything. And I'm probably butchering his arguments as far as why he chooses not to really get into non-duality or see the purpose of it. But I think that's the beauty of non-duality, because it has nothing to do with a state or a level or, some way that you can achieve, because it's not about you. Well, good morning, ma'am, Nikki. You can for sure comment, so welcome aboard here. But when it comes to, achieving some sort of status or eternal state of being, when it comes to having non-duality or achieving non-dual awareness for yourself, it's all about your development and your perspective. And so non-duality doesn't really require you to have a certain perception, awareness, understanding, wisdom, level of development. And so that's where people kind of lose. Okay, well, if it has nothing to do with me growing as a human being or a spiritual being, then what's the point of it? Because I want to get out of the level of consciousness that I'm in currently, and I want to try to achieve this level of non-dual perfection, if you will, because there's an awareness that I'm failing at it, that I cannot achieve it, that it seems like something I'll never get to. And so that's the frustration. So a lot of people want to search out speakers or teachings or practices that will get them to understand and ultimately become non-dual awareness for all time. And in that mindset, it's the concept of non-duality is a state of being. And so with it being a state of being, then it's something that you can achieve, you can become. But there's a lot of teachings that kind of point to the absurdity of that attempt in relation to non-duality, because it's like, what happens after you become enlightened? You were chopping wood before, you become enlightened. What do you do after that? You chop wood. It is what is. So I kind of got into this a little bit on the last talk, but if you were to somehow reach the pinnacle, the peak of the mountain, the absolute truth, enlightenment, and you become no one and everyone, and the truth is, kind of like a Christ-like figure, what does that really change? Because all of us down here in the mucky muck still struggle, still have problems, still see things as separate, still are at different varying levels of consciousness. And so although you have achieved this level of perfect enlightenment, all the rest of us are idiot morons. And so what does that do? It makes you a guru that is somehow above all the rest of us in the the dream world. And so what does that make you better than me? Are you better than me? And so that's where I think people misunderstand this idea of non-duality, because it's some sort of thing to achieve, some sort of state. And I think Course in Miracles gets into this, but it's been a while since I've read it. But it's kind of like a recognition of the enlightenment in others. And so like enlightenment isn't having something for yourself that you are, that you exhibit. It's more of a recognition of the sameness, of the oneness of others. And so it's seeing through the illusion of separation, of the ego, of the personality, and seeing the spiritual being as in not as a soul, but being as a existence in all things. And so it doesn't really, and with that recognition, recognizing, the person that you run into at the grocery store who's having a rough day, treats others like crap, maybe didn't take a shower, isn't the nicest person in the world, maybe stuck in their head, thinking negative thoughts. That person is as much of a child of God as you are, even though you're so much better as an enlightened being. And so the truth of what is in the moment of the person at the grocery store that you are currently judging for being lost in the Maya, in the illusion, the truth of that is still ever present. So it doesn't need that person to change. It doesn't require you to not be a judgmental, a-hole. And so that's kind of the essence of non-duality, because it's not about you becoming better than everyone or above everything or separating you from reality. It's a recognition of the illusion of duality in the truth of non-duality. So that's a little bit of a background as to what I'm trying to say with non-duality, including duality, meaning that non-duality is not in opposition to duality. And so I think a lot of times people conceptually see non-duality as non-duality and duality as two separate things. And so oftentimes the discussion of non-duality is that it is nothing, that is the opposite of the world we see around us, of self-object, of separation. And so non-duality is the absolute emptiness, and duality is what we experience as human beings, with perceptions, with seeing a 3D existence of self and object. And so those two are separated and kind of at battle with one another. So which one is true, which one is false? And so being and living in a dualistic perspective of the world, non-duality seems pointless and useless and meaningless, because it's an opposition to duality. Daryl Sanders says, are you familiar with Art Pinsoff Nothing Media? I feel like Nothing Media is, I feel like I've seen some of their videos that may have had something to do with that conference that I did, or I made videos for. I didn't do the live talks. I must not have been enlightened enough. But I feel like it has a connection to that. I can't remember. But no, I'm sort of familiar with Nothing Media. I guess the question I would have is, why do you ask? Ishta says, beautiful morning to all the beautiful souls. Morning, is that like the English version of spelling morning? Or is that morning like you're in grief? Like, you know how the Brits spell things differently? like they had a lot of U's, like color. Is that a word? COLOUR? I'm blanking out, but morning I misspelled. Okay. Well, I guess no one's perfect, right? Misappelled. Yep. So non-duality is not in opposition of duality. And that's when we talk about non-duality, that's what becomes the separation. That's how we push things. There's an opposition against the two, and that's where I think people lose sight of what the non-duality is really trying to say. Because non-duality means not two, and so by putting the two terms, the two concepts in two separate camps, you're creating a duality, which is in a sense still more duality. Because we perceive in duality, so non-duality is not something that we can really grasp or really understand. It's something we can point to, we can talk about, but you'll never be able to hold on to it. It's like sand slipping through your hands, or if you try to grasp water. I read some story about Bruce Lee and some of his training, and he was in a boat with his teacher, and he tried to grab the water, and he liked the nature of water because you couldn't grasp it; it would go through your hands. I'm butchering his take on it, but it's kind of the same idea with non-duality. Is, you know, the moment you grasp it, it's not it. The moment you say, I get it, or this is non-duality, it becomes untrue, essentially. And so that's where talking about non-duality can be, feel like it's not fruitful. Sometimes I talk about it, especially when I'm trying to like record a video instead of these live talks. I feel a little bit like a fake or a fraud because I know what I'm saying. It's just a bunch of words. And I'll never really be able to explain it fully because it's not something that you can grasp intellectually, because the mind always wants to question, always wants to say, well, yes, but, well, yeah, but. That's how the mind operates. And so you'll never really fully say, this is it. But if this is it, it doesn't take any work to achieve that, because what is doesn't change. So there's nothing you can do. And once you realize that you're a failure, then I think maybe that's the first step. And asking for forgiveness, maybe the second step. But so when you put duality and non-duality in two separate camps, then it becomes an opposition. But non-duality is simply saying that there is not two. And so duality is not an opposition. Non-duality includes nothing and everything. And so when we think of things in terms of other, self and object, we are creating a sense of duality. And non-duality is simply pointing to the fact that that is not the only truth. That's, you know, kind of one side of the same coin. So we only see half of what is instead of seeing actually what is. And so we, in a sense, live in illusion when we only believe that our perceptions of reality are ultimately true. Ishta says, yes, I know what you mean. Color, honor, parlor in British English. Yes. So is this making sense, I guess, with this? Because when you think of non-duality in terms of nothingness, then it creates a duality of everythingness and nothingness. And all it is simply saying is it's a function of the fact that we separate things in every moment. in conversation, in understanding, we create a duality. And so it's a recognition of what we actively do in every moment to create duality. And so non-duality is kind of pointing to that habit as, existent, sentient beings, if you will, or humans. That's what we do. Because if you say that non-duality is in opposition to duality, then you're not really saying anything different. It's all the same as duality. Isha says, I'm thinking that duality is embedded within non-duality, so to speak. Yes. Because I think if you look at kind of the desire or the intent of those that want to say non-duality and duality are separate, I think the desire is to escape or destroy duality. I mean, that's the kind of the motivation behind it. And so if you want to get rid of duality, non-duality is the answer, obviously, right? Because you don't want to be dual. But the difficult part in this seeming process is to recognize that it's a fool's errand to try to get rid of duality, because that experiential awareness will never go away as a human being, in a way, because we continue to chop wood, if you will, or we continue to be human beings. And so how other non-dual speakers talk about it is they refer to themselves as the third person, or they say this isn't happening, or in this moment, this is the experience. So when I act like an a-hole, this is what is happening, right? So if I'm not acting as other people would see an enlightened being acting, well, that's just what is happening. And so it's kind of this mental gymnastics, this disconnect between as we would perceive that person. So if I see someone at the grocery store, like in the previous example, acting a certain way, they smell bad, they're muttering to themselves, they seem to be in a really bad mood, I don't see that as being enlightened behavior. And so I say, hey, well, that person isn't a non-dual master, obviously. And yet, if they were to claim to be a non-dual enlightened being, then how they would frame that is, well, I'm enlightened, but my behaviors are just happening. It is what it is. And so it's kind of like a cop-out, which in a way is true, and that's what the frustrating part of it is. But that's where, if you're going to be completely honest, it's not, and I think speakers are trying to get to this, but we perceive it differently. And so when they say, well, this is just happening, it's not a cop-out for the behavior. It's just a recognition that we're still perceiving that person as separate. Mike A says, Russ, do I have it right to say that there is no separate entity or individual? And if that is the case, there's simply a series of stimulus and corresponding responses. Do I have it right to say that there is no separate entity or individual? And if that is the case, there is simply a series of stimuluses and corresponding responses. Yes and no, I would say. I think for all intents and purposes, to say that there is no separate entity or individual from the individual or separate entity's perspective, that will never be true. So from the separate self, I will never believe that there is no separate entity or individual. I'll always believe that I'm an individual, because the perception, the understanding comes from this sense of being separate. And so intellectually, and like I said in my last video, the belief, the mental process comes after the claiming of being separate. So first you attach to your separation, this body, the mind, and then the story comes after that. So you'll never, as a separate individual, be able to grasp non-duality. You'll never be able to see yourself as not a separate entity or individual. So in that sense, it'll never be true. But in another sense, through inquiry or understanding or, epiphany, you'll find that your beliefs, your mental constructs, your understanding of yourself and reality are built on a lot of illusory projections, if you will. And so if you see who you are for what it is, you'll understand that ultimately there is no separate entity, because how I perceive myself is this body, this mind, as separate from everything else. But like I said in my other video, there's all these bacteria, virus, little bugs. Like your body is built of all these organisms. It's made of water. It's all these things that you have no control over, that, even just the flora in your intestinal tract, your gut, essentially does all these magnificent things that you have no conceptual control over. Yeah, you can eat different things, you can change your diet or your focus, your awareness, but at the end of the day, it is what it is. And so our concept of our separation is kind of a mental construct based on the habitual representation of who we see ourselves to be, essentially. And that's where, science and non-duality, even though there's a definite political bent in one direction, they try to point to that, the scientific, kind of rational, conceptual truth of non-duality, which I think can be a freeing way of understanding it. But at the end of the day, it'll never completely prove the argument, because it's unprovable. So you can point to the fact that your hand is made up of individual cells. Within those cells, you have nucleus, you have DNA, you have atoms, you have protons, neutrons, electrons, quarks, and you get down to the base of it. What do we see is the base of our existence. It's the kind of the wave particle. It's the emptiness that we never find a solid structure. And so it gets into physics and quantum mechanics that I'm not an expert on, but there seems to be kind of a reality of a lack of solidity. And if you think about it, our perception of solidity is illusory, because right now I have all these, I don't know how many, but let's say thousands of cells dying and regenerating. I'm not perceiving those as being not me or me. That doesn't change who I see myself to be. I'm losing skin cells, I'm probably losing hair, that sort of thing. And I'm sitting in a chair. So there's all this animation, this vibration, this constant motion that's happening. And I'm sitting in a chair in a room. on a planet that's spinning, that is going through space at however fast in relation, because it's always in relation to other objects, because speed is, there's always a space-time kind of connection, because it's always, speed is kind of in relation to other objects. Because if we were one planet and there was nothing else in the universe, we would be going nowhere, because there's nothing else to compare it to. So there's always a connection. There's never a separation between self and other. There's always a relationship between, and that's where kind of pointing to what non-duality is talking about. And so, but as of this, there's other objects, stars, planets, our sun, our moon, that we move in relationship to. And I don't perceive that movement. It's just like if you're sitting in a car or a train and you're moving 85 miles down the road, you don't perceive yourself as moving that quickly within the space or the environment that you're in. Everything seems to be static or settled. But if you stop suddenly, you're getting into a car accident, you'll find out really quick how fast you're going in relation to the outside world. So that's where the perception of who you are is based on a pretty flimsy construct, if you will. And so that's where, to your question, as far as, are we just a series of stimulus and corresponding responses? Yes, it's all communication. It's all at the base level. It's all, because even our consciousness is in relation to other objects that we kind of define through language. But even within our bodies, our cells are corresponding, communicating with other organisms within the body, other things within your body, whether it's protein or bacteria or whatever. And then within kind of at the base level, you have electrons spinning around your nucleus. Those are communicating with those around you. So they create forms and structures. You have, there's a chaos to it as far as chaos theory, but there is a structure to it. There is there seems to be a divine blueprint, a divine geometry that things connect in certain ways. It's kind of a mathematical thing, but you see the structure of crystals in snowflakes and different things like that. Those form together in certain ways. So those electrons, those atoms are communicating together in certain ways, and there's a balance between them. But it's always a relationship based. There's never like a separate one or the other. And so even at that level, you don't think of atoms as being conscious, but in a sense they are, because they're communicating between stimulus and response. And so our stimulus and response is a lot more complex. There's a lot of layers and development, and that's kind of where spiral dynamics comes into. But there's so much layers that there's this perception that we are somehow the only conscious sentient beings. And in a narrow way, yes, our consciousness is different than others. We're made in the image of God, and that's kind of the meaning of that. But consciousness, awareness, however you define it, and that's where, that plays a big role in that. That's where that is key in understanding that if you loosely define consciousness, everything is consciousness, everything is relationship, everything is communicating with everything around it. It's just the level of communication is maybe less complex. And so, you're kind of dealing with development tends towards more depth, more freedom, more simplistic complexity, if you will. Daryl Sanders says, no, nothing makes sense. Whatever sense is. Mike A., is there a difference between non-duality and Advaita teachings? Okay, I'm going to be honest, Mike. I'm not an expert on kind of the Eastern Advaita or Vedanta teachings. I've seen a few videos, but that's kind of where my understanding ends, I guess, if you will. So I can't really speak to that very well, and I'm not going to try, because I think sometimes people, I feel like it would be lazy of me to try to speak on that without having really any clue. And I think that's where sometimes people who think they know everything want to explain things they don't know anything about, and jump to conclusions, because it's easy to have a rational explanation for something that just sounds plausible, but it doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It may make sense, like, but it doesn't necessarily prove anything or actually point to the truth. It's just a lazy person's way of saying that I know something that you don't. So I usually try to avoid going down that road. Ish just says, Mike AI, submit that the recognition of those stimuli and its corresponding responses is the real you. I would say at the base level, yeah. All right, so keep asking questions. I'm going to get a little bit more un café. Yeah, thanks. All right. No more questions since I've been gone. I must be doing a really good job. And I think last week, maybe it was Mike or someone asked me, I think Mike asked me, why I make these videos. And I think one thing I enjoy about them is it's, probably a control thing. Because it's kind of like when I watched Paul Hederman talk, he gets in a flow and a rhythm. And, he includes different nuances to what he's saying. A lot of it's kind of the same structure, the same things that he says, but I think he gets kind of a rhythm and a beat to what he's explaining, and so he doesn't really have questions in between that. I think he kind of waits till the end, and that's what I kind of enjoy about being able to just speak, because if you're in social I can't talk, social situation, there we go, where you have other people trying to talk, then it's kind of a dance. It's a dance where, if the person that is maybe doing the most talking maybe should be doing more listening, and it's kind of always a give and take. And so I think there's a great thing to that form of, getting together as a group and discussing things. There's a lot more back and forth. But I think on the flip side of that, I like this format because it allows me to still communicate, still dialogue, but then if I'm going on a certain line, I can continue on with that and continue to focus on that versus, get distracted, get interrupted, that sort of thing. It kind of gives me a little bit more freedom to discuss. And so from a format standpoint, that's part of the reason why I like making these videos. It's more enjoyable than recording, because when I record, I want to make sure it's, it's a little bit more cut and dry, a little bit more succinct than a bunch of babbling, because, you're trying to get more out of it. But this is more of a kind of a back and forth with the ability for me to communicate within the flow that seems natural. That's getting a little bit more meta, but that's what I like to do. All right. Let's see. Oh, Daryl Sanders says, what do you mean by real? When Ishta says corresponding responses is the stimuli and its corresponding responses is the real you. What do you mean real? It's both real and unreal. Nikki says, did you take the last of the coffee? There's maybe like the mud at the bottom. Bring me some coffee, Russ. Well, I think you said you're in Louisiana, so that may be kind of a far trip. You're better off just making some on your own, because it'd be cold by the time we got there. Let's see. Christine Pass says, just wanted to say thank you for doing this talk. It's lovely to hear others discussing oneness. Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining. Do you have any questions? That's what I would ask you, Christine. Ishta says, Christine, absolutely nice to be with like-minded people. Yeah, that's the other part of these talks that I enjoy is I feel like with non-duality, it's one of those topics. I think maybe eventually it'll become kind of like I guess popular, or kind of be like something that, you know, if Oprah is still around, doesn't get thrown in jail. Just kidding. That's a side note. But if Oprah is still is still you know, free and has her shows or whatever, then you know, I think maybe in 10 years or so it'll kind of catch on and be something that she would do you know, a book club about or something like that, like on that level of mainstream. But I think non-duality is not built for mainstream because it's not like you know, The Secret or what's the other thing? Basically like The Power of Positive Thinking, where you're trying to get something out of what you're doing. And so it's not like giving you anything ultimately. I think depending on how your interpretation of non-duality, you can seemingly be something that you can achieve, or that's something you can go into it with the motivation to believe. But at the end of the day, I think it's relegated to the periphery, to the fringe, to a small segment of the population that understands the potential, the realness of it, if that makes sense. And so I don't know how even your biggest non-dual speakers will likely be, you know, won't be making a bunch of money selling books and doing talks. Maybe to the, you know, small, dedicated followers, but at the end of the day, it's not a topic that's going to necessarily grow in popularity, because if it did, I think, I don't know, because it has nothing to do with development, but, you know, as we go through transitions as humans in society, I think as you maybe grow into other forms of consciousness or different levels of development, that is kind of that area where things are in flux. Maybe it lets people be more open to the idea, because the belief system of who you are, of your belief of life and culture in the world is called into question. It's not like you're now going to be a non-dual master, because it doesn't matter what level we're talking about, but that openness to understanding the illusion of how you perceive yourself and others maybe lends to this topic. But it is nice for people that have come to it, that understand the relevance or find meaning in it, meaning in the meaninglessness. It's nice to be able to communicate with those people, because most of the people in my everyday life hear this stuff and they find no relevance. And so there's no, it doesn't open the door for the conversation unless that person is open-minded or curious or willing to talk about it. So that's kind of been my experience. On here, I can communicate with all you people, and I'm assuming there's a similar kind of connection with the topic of non-duality. Ishta says, Oprah did present Eckhart Tolle to a larger audience. He is a gateway to non-duality, as Wayne Dyer was another gateway for me. Yes. So I don't want to rag on Oprah too much. I don't, from a political standpoint, she was involved with the, what was the name of that group? Let me find it here. They were all about, how do we depopulate the earth and get rid of all the useless feeders. It's like the Good Club. Let's see here. I didn't come prepared to present this information. It's the Good Club. The names of some of the members are familiar figures. This is back in 2009, so a little while ago. Bill Gates, George Soros, Warren Buffett, Oprah Winfrey, David Rockefeller, Ted Turner. And they met to talk about, how do we fix the dangers of overpopulation and all that stuff. So anyway, that's kind of a little bit about how I see things. But, in general, it's usually not a all bad, all good situation. So, having Oprah do her kind of spiritual talks and stuff, I think can open people to these topics, like Eckhart Tolle and Wayne Dyer and all that. Isha says, even though those authors are not pure non-dual teaching per se. Well, yeah, but no one's really a pure non-dual teaching, I guess, to some extent. Daryl Sanders, well, you just have to mix it with enough BS for it to be widely embraced, like Eckhart Tolle. Yeah, I think to your point, Daryl, that's where there has to be some level of here's my assumption. I think there has to be some level of, is it called the Good Club? I feel like it was a different name, but anyway, you can research that yourself with Oprah and all that. But like with Eckhart Tolle, I think there has to be a level of desire to want to be known, to want to be followed. I don't know. I'm just making assumptions here. But I think non-duality is the great equalizer. So like, if I were to go on Oprah's show, I probably, would be nervous just because it would be, I don't know if she does a show anymore, but I know her magazine got canceled. But, it's like one of those things where, just being in an environment that I'm not familiar with, it would be probably nerve-wracking. But at the same time, Oprah puts on her pants one leg at a time, just like all of us. So it's, fame and all that's not something that I necessarily care about. And maybe Eckhart Tolle does or doesn't. I don't know. Mike K says, at the end of the day, non-duality really doesn't have anything to offer the individual. It actually starves the individual who is seeking something. I think that's what it can feel like. I think when people get introduced to non-duality, there is a reaction from the separate self or the individual that is seeking. And so, at least in my understanding, the individual doesn't want to be eradicated. And so there's this struggle And so what ends up happening is the individual becomes the non-dual awareness, becomes or strives to become that thing that you're trying to achieve. And so there's a reaction, there is a struggle for control from the individual, but the struggle itself is coming from the separate self in a way. So where it's perceived by the separate self or the individual as a struggle between pure awareness, non-duality, and the separate self, whereas the struggle is the separate self, if you will. I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but if the individual feels starved, it's because the individual is believing a lie that it has to be starved, that there is some reason for it to not be there. It's the cult of death, essentially. It wants to kill itself because in the process of trying to deconstruct or eliminate its reality, it feeds the belief that it exists. And so there's no reason to destroy the self or to see the individual as bad, because that in itself is the individual acting out. And so it's another mental construct belief that we think that we're doing anything to the individual. The individual that believes that it has to be starved is the individual believing it. Nikki says, are you talking about my blank stare? That was a while ago, so I don't remember, but Isha says, yeah, I don't agree with Oprah's politics either. Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of people who think that, it's never them that has to depopulate themselves. It's all the rest of us that are ruining everything. They need to fly in private jets and eat lobster and all that. The rest of us can eat dirt and bugs. Daryl Sanders says, I agree, Mike. Mike A says, I would say that Tony Parsons or Jim Newman, for me, are the closest pure messages of non-duality. Yeah, I think, I guess I was introduced to Tony Parsons kind of originally as far as like a speaker of non-duality, and kind of found Jim Newman after. I feel like, and maybe this the timeline of my understanding was to see Tony Parsons first. I don't know the backstory, who came out, but my impression, and I could be totally wrong, is that Jim Newman kind of copies the techniques of Tony Parsons. And so, I think once you understand what Tony Parsons and Jim Newman are doing, it's kind of easy to put on that show, essentially, because it's a certain language, it's a certain way that they phrase things and how they present it. And I think it's good because the mind is constantly trying to create a story, try to say yes, but, or be like, well, yeah, but that's not true. And Tony Parsons and Jim Newman are like, stop it. No, they don't give you an inch. And that's where I think it's kind of a mirror that allows you to react to what they're saying. And eventually you get tired of hearing their BS, and you're like, I'm tired of fighting this game. I want to understand. And they give you nothing. They give you nothing out of it. So that's where I think their technique works. But so I would agree. I think they do a pretty good job. But I think people put them on pedestals just like everyone else. Christine Pass says, you talked about non-duality not being an achievement-based thing. Don't you feel, though, that opening oneself to non-duality changes the environment around a person? Don't you feel, though, that opening oneself to non-duality changes the environment around a person? I think kind of like the biblical line where, to those who have ears will hear. I think it's kind of a chicken and egg situation where those that are open to what non-duality is saying allows the freeing nature of non-duality to come into their existence. So it changed, yes, in a way it changed the environment around the person, but was it understanding non-duality versus other things? Because, if you talk about epiphanies or peak experiences, there are things that you can do to achieve those types of experiences, and then there are times where it takes no effort. And so it's kind of one of those situations where, are you drawn to non-duality because it gives you something that helps you to free yourself of your delusions, or are you drawn to it because of that? Or what I'm saying, are you doing the freeing, or is non-duality doing the freeing of you? I mean, that's the question. And so I think the truth of non-duality at whatever stage or level of development or consciousness, by keeping an open mind, if you will, from a rational human standpoint, allows you to see things more clearly, because it holds you from falling into those same traps, if you will. And I think what often happens, if you look at spiral dynamics and development, what often happens is, as you transition from one level to a deeper or higher level, however you want to describe it, it's kind of like a nested egg thing, or like an onion. So you transcend and include. As you move to a new level of development, oftentimes, if you're not aware of the illusion of the self, or that reality, then what happens is you see your former, the one that you're transitioning out of, the former state of consciousness or level, as being negative or bad. And so from a standpoint of a healthy transition versus an unhealthy transition, it can play a factor into understanding kind of where you've been and where you're going. Because if it's kind of like arrested development. So if you're moving to another level of consciousness, either individually or as a society, and you don't see it for what it is as clearly, through tinted, glasses, if you will. If you don't see it for what it is, then oftentimes you can revert to lower stages of development, thinking that you're being progressive, but you're actually regressive, because you're seeing the former states as being a negative thing, versus seeing the truth of those former levels of development and continue to absorb them into the sense of identity. You try to negate all of it, because the new level becomes the truth, even though it's just partial, if you will. And in a book that I really like from Ken Wilber, that it's been a long time I've read it, but Boomeritis talks about the mean green meme, which is kind of where I think the center of gravity of our society, at least in the West and the United States, is transitioning into kind of the more green, inclusive type, egalitarian type mindset, collective sort of a mindset. But the negative aspect, the dark side of that, is to get rid of the depth of individuality and say that individuality is a bad thing. But that's where I see the disconnect. And he gets kind of into that. It's a story format. But that's where I kind of see as far as being open to these types of discussions. At least there's an awareness of your limitations that maybe other people don't have. But are you drawn to it because of the message, or is it because you're now open to it? Like, does the teacher come when you're ready for it? Or because if it's like Neo in the Matrix, the Oracle told him a bunch of stuff, but he wasn't ready to hear it. And was it because she didn't tell him that, or he just wasn't open to hearing it? Daryl says, I have an issue with the word pure, define pure. I kind of don't usually say like pure awareness because it's kind of like, it doesn't really mean anything. I like how Paul Hederman says dog crap awareness. It's just another, thing people are trying to achieve versus the awareness of the individual. They should make Isha says they should make a reality show where they dump Russ, Jim Newman, and Tony Parsons, Lisa Cairns, and LMA on a tropical island. Oh boy. I think what would happen is some of those people would probably sit on the beach and expect to have everything handed to them and to get food and build shelter. And so I'd probably be the one doing all the work. And they would say, there is no coconuts. There is no, bamboo. There is no me. This isn't happening. There is nothingness. I'm not even here. I didn't show up. It's just this. Meanwhile, I would have to collect all the wood and the food and the fresh water, and that's probably what would happen. Daryl says, what happened to LMA? Laugh loud. No comment on that, but I like LMA. Isha says she comes and goes on YouTube. Yeah, I think she's kind of like me, where there's kind of a indifference, or what's the right word? Ambivalence to these talks, or non-duality in general. Daryl says, on one of her videos, she was completely drunk. Yeah. I should try that someday. It would probably be, I don't know what it would be, but probably wouldn't do that talk in the morning. Well, in about a month or so, I'll probably do maybe a little series of a few more in a row versus kind of once a week. So that's always an idea. Christine says, fabulous response to environment inquiry. Thank you. My separate self ego really enjoys your praise, because that's, I guess sometimes I struggle with whether I explain things well. My experience is usually when I'm not doing talks and I go throughout my daily life, I have these kind of realizations or things that pop up in my head that say, oh, this is a great way to explain it. Or it's almost like, like instant downloads where you're like, oh, this makes sense. And then you kind of form the words around that awareness, around that kind of small epiphany. And in those moments, I'm like, oh, that would be a good way to talk about it on these live talks. But then, I guess I could write it down and try to prepare it. But usually by the time I get on here and start talking, it's I never explain it exactly to the to the level that I want to or try to. But that's the beauty of non-duality. That's probably why I like it, is the fact that there's there's no mistakes. It is what it is, and whether or not I explain something perfectly, you're gonna see it how you see it, and I think that's the beauty of it. And I think if you're aware of your reactions to what I say, instead of saying, well, what Russ is saying is so true, or I wish I could understand it like he does, if that does pop into your head, it's more of observing or being aware of your reactions to what I'm saying and your reactions to this message to really give you a better idea of maybe those areas that you are still hung up on. And those signposts, those messages, those things that kind of point you in the right direction pop up in response to the illusion that you are currently believing. That makes sense. So it's always pulling you towards the truth of what is. And if you listen to those, I don't want to call them warnings, but if you listen to those messages, then it'll help. So it's kind of like, let me explain it this way. So you have a kind of a polarity of positive and negative. And so when you believe something, it creates this duality of belief, unbelief, or whatever it is you're thinking about. It creates a separation. And so it's like two poles. And so positive and negative, if you look at magnetism, those are drawn to each other. So why are those drawn to each other? Because it's trying to bring it back to a level of equilibrium, neutrality, and non-duality. And so you have positive and negative, they're drawn to each other naturally. And so that's where, and so what does that take to do that? It's kind of the concept of time. And so if you get rid of the idea of time, those things are automatically joined together. So if you believe that they're separate and in time they'll come together, then that is where there's an understanding of non-duality. But without time, the fact that they're separate automatically includes the keys of togetherness, the ultimate conclusion. So the fact that you believe something is separate assumes the connection. And so the connection is already there. It's through time that we believe that separation exists. But the connection is always there. It just takes time. But when there is no time, the connection is there. And so that's with any kind of belief of reality or a belief about yourself. The answer, the key that unlocks the truth is built in. It's made in, it's baked into the cake, if you will. And so it's already there. It doesn't have to be created. It's in duality, non-duality exists. In the belief of separation, forgiveness exists, or in duality, non-duality exists. Non-duality includes duality. All right. Any more questions? I think we're going to wrap it up here. I want to thank everyone for joining. And the next time you see the arrow garden here, I'm going to dry a bunch of the basil because it's kind of growing out of control. It's starting to go to seed. So it'll look a little different. And that shows you the illusion of change. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I got one Bible section I want to quick read. Oh, Ishta. Hugs to you, Russ Rap, and everyone else. Beautiful day. Yes. Buen dia. All right, so Luke 17, 20 through 21. Luke 17, 20 and 21. Once, having been asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus replied, "The kingdom of God does not come with your careful observation, nor will people say, 'Here it is,' or 'There it is,' because the kingdom of God is within you." Or the kingdom of God is among you. Pretty cool stuff. All right, so thank you for joining. And if you leave comments in this video after, if you thought of something that you weren't able to ask, or if you watch other videos and comment, I enjoy kind of that interaction. So we will talk in the moment, in some other moment.